Topic 2.3, Flows of Energy and Matter. So we've discussed what trophic pyramids are and how energy flows through living things. And we've discussed how matter can flow through them. Matter is recycled, but energy is not. Let's look into this in a little more detail. So all energy starts from the sun. Solar radiation comes to us in many, many forms. Radio waves, microwaves, infrared, ultraviolet, gamma, and so forth. About half of it is absorbed by our atmosphere before it ever hits Earth. When it does hit Earth, the Earth absorbs much of this energy and then reflects it back in lower energy. Of course, the important part is that a lot of this energy is absorbed by autotrophs, producers, who then convert it into usable food that heterotrophs can use, and life becomes possible on the planet. So we can then say the ecological efficiency is the amount of energy then that's used for growth divided by the total energy that's supplied. And in general, we pretty much work on a 10% rule. Most energy is being lost. Only about 10% is actually being transferred as it goes from one form of life to another. So let's talk about energy. We tend to talk about it in environmental science as productivity. This is the amount of biomass per area that's being generated, kilograms per square meter per year. And we can talk about it in two different ways: gross productivity, which is the total gain, but really what we're interested in is net productivity. In other words, we've already seen that there's an enormous amount of loss because of various processes. So how much is something actually gaining net productivity? That's what we want to look at. Now, we discussed that there are many different types of ecosystems in the world, and different ecosystems have different productivity, or maybe a better way to say it is that the reason why they are different ecosystems is because they have different productivity. So you can see here that deserts, very, very low, whereas as we go over here to grasslands and forests, estuaries and so forth, much, much higher productivity is going on there. Now there's two different ways we could think about productivity, primary and secondary. It's a little vague, a little confusing, but let's try and make it easy. Primary productivity is that which is gained by autotrophs. Pretty much what we're talking about are plants. So primary productivity is pretty much how plants convert solar radiation into a gain of sugar by the process of photosynthesis. Whereas secondary productivity is how heterotrophs, by consuming things, then acquire new biomass and energy. Again, it's never 100% efficiency, and there are losses that involve. The major loss that's going on here is respiration in primary. And so if you take gross and you minus the loss of respiration, that's the net gain of energy that they're really having there. And let's not forget that plants do respiration besides photosynthesis. In heterotrophs, it's a little more complicated. They also do respiration. And when we talk about respiration, obviously we're talking about cellular respiration, not just breathing. But we also lose a lot of food through feces, which plants don't. So we'd have to subtract those to get our net. And we refer to them then as net primary productivity. Pretty much, let's think about plants. And net secondary productivity, pretty much, let's think about this as animals to keep it simple. So let's go back to primary productivity. Energy comes in through sunlight. Mass comes in through carbon dioxide and water. Byproducts are oxygen, and then we produce glucose. But remember, we're also producing ATP, the form of chemical energy. So how are you going to do these calculations, right? So it's fairly easy to set up an experiment. All you have to do basically is take some sort of plant, grow it in the light, and take an identical plant, grow it in the dark, and then subtract the two, and that should tell you what's going on there. So let's suppose that we have two plants like this, and we put one in the dark, one in the light. And let's suppose that the one that we expose to sunlight has an increase of 2 milligrams, and the one that we put in the dark has a decrease of 3 milligrams. So the plant in the light, remember, is doing both photosynthesis and respiration. So that 2 milligrams would then represent the net productivity, primary productivity. But the plant in the dark is not doing photosynthesis, it's only doing respiration, so the loss of 3 milligrams is actually the respiration. So if we take that net equals 2, and we have 3, we can then put those two together. That would get us back to the gross primary productivity, which would be 5 milligrams. So that's pretty easy to do. Doing an experiment to calculate gross secondary productivity is a little more complicated, because not only do we have to measure the mass of things, but we have to measure feces and so forth. So that's a little more complicated. And I think I'm going to go ahead and skip this calculation because it's a little more involved. Now we can represent here a nutrient cycle, and it's represented by Gershmel's model. Gershmel came up with a pretty simple model here. He said that we're going to have basically 3 sinks of nutrients, of material, which he called biomass. Biomass means it's in the living system. Soil speaks for itself. And litter is what is covered on top of the soil. And so if it's a forest, we're basically talking about biomass being in the trees. Litter would be all the leaves and decaying material sitting on top, and what goes into the soil is what has been decomposed. And we can gain and lose things by weathering and leaching and so forth. The size of these circles here will vary depending on what biome we're talking about. So if you're looking at a desert, there's not a whole bunch of things growing there, so we don't have a lot of biomass. There's not a whole lot of things, leaves and so forth, falling on the ground. Most of the mass is being stored actually in the soil. In contrast, in a tropical rainforest, very, very busy, high growth rates here, most of the mass is being in the biomass in the living trees and animals and so forth, whereas much smaller amounts are being put in the litter and the soil.